My name is Claire. And this is the story of how my late father-in-law saw it coming before any of us did. I met my husband Daniel when we were both 24. He was kind in the way that people sometimes are when they've grown up watching someone be unkind carefully, deliberately, like it was something he had to practice. His mother, Margaret, was warm to me at first. Effusive even. She called me the daughter she never had at our engagement dinner. She held my hand across the table and told me I was exactly what Daniel needed. I believed her. That was my first mistake. We got married in the fall. Daniel worked in commercial real estate. I worked nights at a hospital 40 minutes away, which meant I was rarely home when Margaret visited, and Margaret visited often. She had a key. Daniel had given it to her years before we met, and when I gently suggested that maybe we could establish some boundaries, he looked at me with that careful kindness of his and said, "She's alone, Claire. She just misses me." So I let it go. The trouble started about 8 months into our marriage. Daniel's father, Robert, had passed away 2 years before we met. He had been, by every account, a quiet and serious man, an accountant who kept meticulous records of everything, who said little, but noticed much. I never got to meet him. I knew him only through photographs, and through the occasional thing Daniel said, which was never very much, and through the way Margaret never said anything about him at all, which told me more than anything else. Robert had left behind a modest estate, a house, some savings, and a small investment portfolio that Margaret controlled entirely. Daniel had never asked about the details. He trusted his mother the way people trust the ground beneath their feet without thinking about it, because the alternative is too frightening. The first time Margaret accused me of theft, it was in private. She called me while I was on my lunch break at the hospital. I was eating a sandwich in a parking garage because the break room smelled like burnt coffee and I needed 10 minutes of quiet. She told me, very calmly, that she had noticed some jewelry missing from a box she kept in Daniel's childhood bedroom, a room that was still set up exactly as it had been when he was 17, which should have told me something about Margaret that I hadn't fully understood yet. "I'm not saying it was definitely you," she said, in the tone of someone who was absolutely saying it was definitely me. "I'm just saying you're the only one who's been in that room recently." I told her I hadn't touched anything in that room. I told her I had barely been in that house, which was true. I worked nights. I slept days. Our visits to Margaret's house were Sunday dinners that I attended maybe twice a month because of my schedule. She made a small sound, sympathetic, almost. "Of course," she said. "I'm sure you didn't mean any harm." I hung up and stared at the concrete wall of the parking garage for a long time. I told Daniel that evening. He listened with his forehead creased in the way it did when something troubled him, but he didn't want to say so. Then he said his mother was probably just confused, that she had been more forgetful since his father passed, and that I shouldn't take it personally. I nodded. I went to work that night. I took care of 3 patients in serious condition and made decisions that affected whether they lived or died. I came home at 7 in the morning and lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thought about the word confused and what it was doing in that sentence. By the time 6 more months had passed, the accusation had traveled. I didn't know it at first. I found out the way you find out most things in a small town, which is sideways, a comment that wasn't quite a comment, a pause that lasted a second too long. A nurse manager at the hospital where I'd applied for a day shift position told me the position had been filled. A clinic 10 minutes from our house never called me back after my second interview. A home health agency I'd worked with briefly as a student suddenly had no openings. I thought it was bad luck. I thought it was timing. Then I ran into a woman named Patricia at the grocery store. Patricia was a neighbor of Margaret's, and she was the kind of person who operated entirely without a filter, which at that moment turned out to be the most useful thing in the world. She looked at me over a display of canned soup and said, "Oh, honey, are you doing okay? Margaret mentioned you'd been going through some things." I asked her what kind of things. Patricia looked uncomfortable for exactly 1 second, and then the filterless part of her took over. She said you'd taken some things from her house. A ring that belonged to Daniel's grandmother, some cash she kept in a drawer. She said she didn't want to go to the police because of Daniel, but she felt like people should know, just in case. I stood in that grocery store aisle for what felt like a very long time. The fluorescent lights hummed. Someone's cartwheel squeaked past. "She said that to you," I said. "And a few others," Patricia said, now visibly regretting the entire conversation. "I'm sorry. I thought you knew." I drove home with my groceries, and I sat in our kitchen, and I did something I hadn't let myself do in months. I cried. Not because I was sad, but because I was suddenly, completely furious, and the fury had nowhere to go, and crying was the only thing my body knew how to do with that much pressure behind it. When Daniel came home, I told him everything Patricia had said. I watched his face go through several things in quick succession: disbelief, discomfort, and then a settling that I recognized and hated, a retreat into the place where he kept all the things he didn't want to deal with. "I'll talk to her," he said. "You've said that before." "I mean it this time. What she's telling people." "Daniel, that's defamation. That could follow me. That's already following me. Do you understand that I haven't been able to get a job in our town in 6 months?" He said he understood. He said he would handle it. He looked genuinely pained, which I knew was real, and I also knew was not enough. He talked to Margaret. Margaret cried. She said she was devastated that I had interpreted her concern as an accusation. She said she had only ever wanted to protect her son. She said she had found the ring. Actually, it had been in a different box all along. She was so sorry for any confusion. Daniel came home and told me that his mother had found the ring. I looked at him. "She found it," he said again, as if repeating it would help. "Daniel," I said, "she told Patricia. She told whoever else Patricia heard it from. Finding the ring doesn't undo that." He nodded. He agreed with me. And then, because he had agreed and talked to his mother and she had cried and found the ring, he considered the matter resolved. It was not resolved. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that Margaret's conversations had been much wider than Patricia. She had been to the hospital board fundraiser where the nursing director sat on the committee. She had mentioned it, casually, to the wife of the man who ran the home health network. She had said it. In the careful way she said everything, not an accusation, just a concern, just something she felt people should be aware of, the way good neighbors are aware of things. I applied to 11 positions over the next year. I got 3 callbacks, 2 second interviews, and 0 offers. I started picking up occasional shifts through a staffing agency 2 towns over, where nobody knew Margaret and the assignments were inconsistent, and the pay barely covered gas. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself Daniel would eventually understand the full scope of what his mother was doing. I told myself a lot of things in those years that were technically true and ultimately useless. Our marriage was fraying in the quiet way that marriages fray when one person is drowning and the other is standing on the bank saying they believe you're drowning but not quite reaching in. The night everything changed, I wasn't expecting anything to change. It was a Tuesday. I had just gotten home from a 12-hour shift. I was still in my scrubs, eating leftover pasta over the sink, when Daniel's phone buzzed on the counter. He was in the shower. I wasn't trying to read it. I just saw the name on the screen. It was from a name I didn't recognize: Gerald Hines. The preview text said, "Please call me before you speak to your wife. This is urgent and concerns your father's estate." I put the pasta down. Daniel came out of the shower. I pointed at his phone. He read the message, and his face did something I hadn't seen it do in a long time. It went very still. Not the stillness of retreat. The stillness of something shifting underneath. He called Gerald Hines in front of me. I sat at the kitchen table and I listened. Gerald Hines, it turned out, was a private attorney. He had been retained by Robert Daniel's father, approximately 16 years ago, with instructions that were specific and unusual. He was not to make contact with Daniel until certain conditions were met. Those conditions, Gerald explained carefully, related to the management of Robert's estate and certain actions that Robert had apparently anticipated might occur. Daniel sat down very slowly in the chair across from me. Gerald said he had been monitoring the situation, that Robert had left detailed instructions about what to watch for, and that recent events had triggered the final condition. He asked if Claire was present. Daniel looked at me. I nodded. Daniel said yes. Gerald said, "Your father wanted Claire to hear this too. He wrote that specifically. I pressed my hand flat against the table to keep it from shaking. What Gerald told us took about 40 minutes. I'm going to tell you the important parts. Robert had known his wife for 34 years. He had loved her, in his way. He had also understood her, which is a different thing entirely. He understood that Margaret operated through a particular mechanism, that she controlled what she loved by diminishing what threatened that love. He had watched her do it to Daniel's friendships in high school. He had watched her do it to the one serious girlfriend Daniel had before me. He had understood, with the sad clarity of a man who kept meticulous records of everything, that when Daniel eventually married, Margaret would do the same thing to his wife. So Robert had planned. He had set aside a portion of his estate separate from what Margaret controlled, held entirely in a trust, managed by Gerald with instructions that it be used in a specific way. Not just money, though there was money. Robert had also compiled a file over the years' records of Margaret's patterns, conversations he had overheard and documented. A letter he had written himself, addressed to Daniel, that Gerald had been holding for 16 years. And there was one more thing. Robert had a sister, Dorothy, who had worked in hospital administration for 30 years before she retired. He had asked Dorothy before he died, before Daniel and I had even met, to be available if needed, to use her network, if the situation he feared came to pass. Dorothy was 71 years old, sharp as a blade, and apparently had been waiting for Gerald's call. Your father wrote, Gerald said, that he was sorry he couldn't protect you in the moment. That was the one thing he couldn't do from where he was going. But he said he could make sure the moment didn't last forever. Daniel put his face in his hands. I sat very still and thought about a man I had never met who had, 16 years before I entered his son's life, decided that whoever Daniel loved deserved to be protected. Dorothy called me 3 days later. She had the brisk warmth of someone who had spent decades managing impossible situations and found them interesting rather than overwhelming. She asked me to send her my resume and my licensure records. She asked me to write a brief summary of the positions I had applied for and the outcomes. Her tone was professional, and her manner made it clear this was a problem to be solved, not a wound to be examined, and I cannot describe how much I needed exactly that in that moment. Within 2 weeks, Dorothy had made 3 phone calls to people she had worked with for decades. She explained accurately, with documentation that Gerald provided, what had been happening. She did not ask for favors. She presented facts and let the facts work. The nursing director at a hospital 25 minutes from our house called me directly. She said she had heard I was looking for a day shift ICU position. She said she had an opening. She said Dorothy had told her about me, and that Dorothy's word was, in her experience, worth more than most references she received. I started 2 weeks later. The morning before my first shift, I sat in my car in the parking lot for 10 minutes. I thought about the 3 years, the 11 applications, the parking garage sandwich and the fluorescent lights and Patricia's face over the canned soup. I thought about Robert sitting at his desk with his meticulous records, watching his wife, loving his son, understanding what he understood and deciding to do something about it anyway, quietly, from a distance, in the only way that was available to him. I thought about how some people protect you loudly, and some people protect you in ways you don't know about until you need them. Margaret, when everything came to light, did not apologize. She said she had only ever been concerned. She said any reasonable mother would have been worried. She said Gerald and Dorothy were interfering in family matters that didn't concern them, which was a remarkable thing to say given the circumstances. Daniel listened to her say all of these things, and when she finished, he said something I had not heard him say to her before. He said, I believe my wife. Not I talked to her. Not I'm sure it was a misunderstanding. I believe my wife. Margaret left and didn't speak to us for 2 months. Daniel and I went to therapy. Not because our marriage was over, it wasn't, but because 3 years of one person drowning and the other person standing on the bank leaves marks on both of them, and we wanted to understand our own marks before they calcified into something permanent. The trust Robert left paid for a portion of it. His letter, which Daniel read to me one evening on our back porch, his voice steady, except for the places where it wasn't said, that he hoped we would use it well, and that he hoped we would be kind to each other, and that he was sorry it took this long. It didn't feel long, I thought, reading it. It felt exactly as long as it needed to be for Daniel to finally say those 4 words out loud. I believe my wife. I work days now. I'm home by 6 most evenings. The hospital is good. My colleagues are good. On my first week, a senior nurse asked me how I'd heard about the position, and I said a friend of a friend had recommended me, which is both the simplest and most accurate version of a very long answer. Sometimes I think about Robert. About the kind of love that looks ahead instead of behind, that plans for the storm instead of pretending the sky is clear. I think about what it costs a person to look at the one they love and understand them fully, shadows and all, and choose to love them anyway, and also to protect the people they will love after you're gone. I never got to thank him. I think about that too. But I keep his letter in the drawer of my nightstand. And on the days when the world feels smaller than it should, when I catch myself second-guessing a room I have every right to be in, I think about a quiet, serious man with meticulous records who saw me coming 16 years before I arrived. And I think, someone was already on my side. Before I needed it. Before I even knew I would. That's a kind of love that doesn't have a name I know of. But it's real. And it saved my life.